I'm joined here today for this panel on mitigating risk, managing and mitigating risk for city projects. Today, unfortunately, my understanding is Ms. Rotimo is not able to make it, so it's just going to be the gentleman up here. But I am joined, we're going to start on the end here with Mr. Judah Moore, Distinguished Fellow for Energy, or Distinguished Fellow at the Center for Energy and Growth Hub. Correct? I'm butchering this already. Just give me a thumbs up anyway. I have next to him right now Mr. Mustafa Njai, CEO of TAF Africa Global. And next to me, I have Mr. Bradford Cross, CEO of Two Lions. So today, I'm going to open up the panel by asking generally to all of our guests here, from your experience working on building, whether it's cities or maybe major infrastructure projects or financing them, what types of risks, political, financial, social, and environmental, do you see as most acute today? And Mr. Moore, I'll start with you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure being here. And I think, first, I've always, if it's infrastructure, I've always come at it from the side of the government. So because I was in the government. And so one of the first risks, of course, is financing. Whether it's a city or is a bridge, a big infrastructure project, is how is that project going to be financed? Now, in my time in government, most of the projects we did, if we were financing those projects, they were being financed by debt, say maybe from the World Bank, the African Development Bank, European, one of the multilateral development agencies, or it's being financed directly from the government's budget. And if it has been, at least in my experience, if it has been financed by a multilateral development agency, there is much more predictability to the financing. If it has been financed out of the government's budget, that predictability drops, and so then there's risk with implementation. Now, the second thing is that risk with implementation means that the project could end up being significantly more expensive, because every time the project has to stop, you pay for idle time because the contractor has already mobilized men, resources, machines, and stuff. And so I think, at least from the government's perspective, what we're looking at in terms of risk is going to be the financing and the ability to keep the project within budget and on time.
Great, Mr. Njai.
Thank you. TAF Africa Global is trying to develop 1 million homes across the continent of Africa. And we develop cities and micro-cities. And our strategy is to work with government. So it's on a PPP. So our greatest risk is political. Because political circles in Africa is between 4 to 5 years. So you sign up with one government, and then we all know that anytime that there's a new government, they want to go back on agreements that have been signed to revisit them. And our projects, on average, are between 15 to 20 years. So this is a major risk. There are other risks that we have. Because we're dealing with land, and massive land, I mean, the community also, it's a huge risk. People believe that the land is theirs, and because the land is given by government, I mean, that's government's contribution to us. So government contributes the land as their equity. But the community will get up. I mean, at times the project is just too big for them. So that's another risk. I mean, there are others, financial in terms of currency risk is also major. I mean, especially in West Africa. I mean, I'll give you an example. In Nigeria, I mean, I have been there since 2012. And around 2015, the currency just, went down. I mean, from 150 naira to the dollar. Today, it's 1,620. And my projects are very long term. So I just list these three, that these are major risks. There's a number, but these are major free risks that we go through.
And Mr. Cross.
All right. I'm going to echo the last one that you mentioned about political change. And in particular, what we've experienced that is even more pernicious and less talked about is the dynamism within administrations. Right, it's very common that we see a president and prime minister model, and already in our first 2 years of operations, I've seen 3 prime minister changes within the same political party. including multi-month like scuffles within the government to figure out who's going to be the next prime minister. And of course, at that point, everybody freezes and waits and see, right? And we've seen it also, of course, with the ministers, because if you have a change of a prime minister, they're going to change all the ministers. If you have an ineffective minister, whether it's agriculture or finance or whatever, then they're going to be fired and changed out. And so, at the minister level and the prime minister level, the dynamism that occurs even within an individual administration is pretty significant, and it's pretty unique to Africa. I've never seen such a dynamic environment like that. And it presents a lot of risks and a lot of unique needs to mitigate those risks. For us, that's meant going very broad, having a very broad set of relationships in the country, having a very clear value prop that everybody can align with, so that you never have one of these projects that's tied to a particular politician, but it's just something that's clearly good that must be done for the entire country. So it's easy to pivot from one stakeholder to another as these changes occur. So that's one. The second one, especially coming in as an international investor and entrepreneur into Africa, there's been historically a massive number of bad deals in Africa with land concessions given to, random Russian or Libyan people that looks more like a money laundering scheme than it does real entrepreneurship and investment. And so a lot of governments in the decades since independence have done a number of these bad deals. And they've got all this land concession sitting out there that they should have clawed back many years ago, that the investors have done nothing with. And frankly, most of the investors that are sitting on those are just speculating. And it's a pretty gross ecosystem, I think, in my opinion. But it's a problem because now you come into many countries, and if they haven't had big wins yet with these kinds of deals, you face immense skepticism. You're basically paying the cost of the poor due diligence that was done in the past when they let a lot of these other stakeholders in that never should have been allowed in, right? They weren't credible investors. They weren't credible entrepreneurs. There was a bunch of dodgy political stuff going on behind the scenes in order for these deals to happen. And then they're skeptical of the good people that are coming in. So, sometimes you get treated even with outright disrespect. And you're like, I haven't even done anything here yet. What's going on? So that one is a serious risk. Like, we actually have to spend a huge amount of time overcoming those concerns. And many times, even after you already think you've overcome it, then another minister or somebody else all of a sudden brings out, oh, well, what about this project from 5 years ago that never happened? They were promising X, Y, Z too, and it never happened. So this legacy of all these bad deals, I think, is a huge risk. Yeah.
Great. Mr. Moore, I couldn't help but notice you smiling a couple times during Mr. Cross's comments. In terms of your experience in government, what do you think, governmental infighting, what role this has in the long-term prospects for projects and issues of the risk around whether or not these projects will ultimately be executed?
Well, I think, as the person who was in government here, I should say that first, infighting within a government is not unique to Africa. For example, right now, if you look at U.S. policy, it seems like one day there's a faction within the administration that wants something else, and there's a faction that wants another thing, and so we see this incoherence in its policy. So it's not like a unique thing to Africa. I think I should also say that there have been instances where investors coming into the country, it wasn't just that they made promises that ended up not being fulfilled, but that the deals they signed were inherently unfair. And so then, because maybe of the incompetence of the people negotiating on behalf of them, or because of the venality of the negotiators. I'll give an example. There was once when I was still an aide in the government, and we were negotiating a mining deal. And the investor was asking for 15 years, and someone on the Liberian team was asking for 25 years for the investor. And he kept pushing for 25 years, and at some point, stopped the negotiation, went to the side to see, like, yo, what's your problem? The investor himself is asking for 15. Why do you keep pushing 25? Only to find out later that he'd been, privately induced. So you have this where investors come in and try to take advantage of weak systems, and then they get a deal that ends up struggling under scrutiny later. However, I should also say that most of our governments are coalitions. Most governments in Africa are a coalition of, say, maybe dominant regions or ethnic groups. Consequently, we come to power with people coming with different ideas of what they're trying to do. And so sometimes you have the president wanting to go in this direction, and the minister who's supposed to execute it is going in a completely different direction. I think one of the ways we get around this is that Brad made the point of making it broad-based. You're talking to people who are technical people. Ministers come and go all the time, but there's technical staff that remain in the ministry, and being able to convince them that this is a project that's worth doing. I think this is one of the ways that we go about it.
And Mr. Njai, in your experience, have you seen issues around governmental change, not like across governments, but within governments? Have you experienced any particular issues with this in terms of the projects you're trying to execute?
Well, I've seen both. I've seen within a sitting government where ministers are changed, and then they would want to change the agreement or even policy. I have seen that. But worst of it all, I don't know whether we have Nigerians who are here. I mean, I am operating in the south side of Nigeria, and I'm building a city there, and that's in Port Harcourt. And I have seen 3 governors come and go from 2012 to date, and I'm still there. So there's one thing that is said in business, that the bigger the risk, the higher the returns. So in Nigeria, most people will not venture doing business in Port Harcourt, because it comes with the security risk, and but politics, it's something else. Currently, actually, a sitting governor who was elected democratically has been suspended by the president at the federal level. So, but we are still there. I mean, we are determined to stay. So we've gone through this all the time. I mean, I'm in Sierra Leone, and as I said, my business strategy is staying in for 15, 20 years. So I'm ready for it, and I know how to do it. One of the things that I do is that I'm not involved politically, and that happens from day one. That once it's politics, I'm out, but we have to find a way of dealing with them. And I have a very good saying that was given to me by a friend. He says, look, if you're doing business with government, it's like the fireplace during winter. Don't get too far, otherwise you'll be killed with cold. But don't get too close, otherwise you'll burn yourself. So you need to be at a position where you keep yourself warm and stay alive. And that's exactly what we do in doing business in Africa.
Great. Bradford, I think you've had a lot of a recent experience with very new projects on the continent. Is there a particular real-world example you'd like to share with us of a particular risk that you've had to deal with in order to move at least one of your projects forward?
Yeah, I mean, we had a major phase of political dynamism in our first anchor partner country, actually, just in the beginning of this year. And it really ended up being, exactly as he said, that the good news is in many African countries, although you may have this top-level dynamism, the people actually doing all the real work don't actually change that much. The only unfortunate part is they tend to freeze sometimes. So they'll be waiting, right, for their new minister. I don't know what's going to happen. And it's like, dude, we all know you're going to have the same job 3 months from now. Just, let's keep going, right? But they'll still be like, oh, I don't know if I'm allowed to, and all this stuff. So, but we've been able to work with them anyways and make a lot of forward progress, even while there's all this political infighting. So it's like you're saying, we're close in the sense that we're still working with the government, the people on the ground doing the real work, but we keep our distance. I don't want to get involved in the politicking and, the political infighting within each party and whatever. You raised the U.S. It's like this is a high-level political drama is something that's endemic across the world. It's the main reason why I'm so excited about the space, because I just don't think it really serves the interest of the people to invest so much time in this political drama. It's better to invest the time in governance and execution. So we try to focus on, let's network to the people that are really focused on governance and execution because they're going to be more stable. And so as the new government formed, we were able to keep running everything forward and still get our deal signed, which was about a 4-month gap from when the prime minister firing occurred to when we actually got our title done. I was supposed to go literally 2 days before they fired the prime minister and sign. And then the whole thing got pushed back 4 months. But many people were concerned it was going to blow up entirely. I think it was our ability to do the kind of networking with the on the ground, more tactical and technical folks within the government. And then also just broadly selling it so that everybody understands why this is such an obvious win for the people. And I've found that a lot of the government officials are like well-intentioned. It's just that they may not necessarily know the right projects to execute and how to execute. But if they can see something that's obviously good for the people if you put it in front of them and it's packaged correctly. And so, regardless of political party or any kind of political infighting, we've been able to get universal buy-in for things that are just obviously good for the people. Like that hasn't been a problem. So I think between those two strategies, we were able to mitigate this and get through, which was huge. Yeah.
Great. I mean, in terms of political drama, I think the joke in the U.S. is that Washington, D.C. is Hollywood for ugly people. That's
good.
I think that probably is sort of the case globally, maybe. Mr. Njai, in terms of your work that you've been doing, what is a particular case where you've overcome a risk recently that has enabled a project to move forward?
Well, the risk, as I said, it's many. Let's take, for example, in Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone, we're building a micro city, 5,000 units. And when we first went in, there were riots by the community, that the land is theirs. When we were given the land by government, and it was ratified by parliament, we made sure that all the T's were cut, the I's were all dotted, but yet still, on the ground, the community came in. So we had to engage them. So then local content is key. The way we structure our business is that because it's a PPP, we make sure that there is a board at the top of the business. And in this board, governing board, the minority is government, obviously, but we are the majority. But even at being majority and being foreign, we make sure we find an eminent person to appoint him as the chair of the board. So, because when you get into any local any African country, you have to give back ownership. I don't know where this happens when we have Western investors coming in, but at times in some countries that I have been, I am seen as, yes, he's just like us, but why is he taking all this land? And because my business is centered around me, I am the sole owner. This is a business I started 35 years ago. So people see me that, why him and not us? Why is he taking our land? So you should be able to mitigate this. So we had a lawyer who was highly respected in Sierra Leone, appointed as our board chair. So then we differentiate, ownership by making sure that there's a local who's involved, and everything is done above board. And he will now know probably what should be done at the local level. And by now, the locals have taken ownership, and they're part of it, and they have seen the benefit of this project. So this is one example that I can give you that we have done in Sierra Leone, although there are many, many, many more.
Great. And Mr. Moore, do you have a case that you'd like to discuss where you've overcome a risk to move a project forward?
Well, again, I sort of found myself in this situation where I have to defend the government. We had a private company come in and try to build a bridge, and the presentation was that there was enough the traffic numbers they had done, there was enough traffic that the project was commercially viable on its own without requiring a guarantee from the government. Well, and then they presented us a document. Fortunately for us, we requested transactional advisory services through the African Development Bank. So we had a law firm, and then we had an engineering group to review the document. And embedded in the document they sent us, maybe on page 42 out of a 60-page or 60 to 80-page document, was a guarantee from the government, even though they had told us that there would be no guarantee from the government. So if we didn't have the transaction advisors, we would enter into an agreement that we signed for something we were told would not be there. So having a transaction advisor helped the government get out of that. And so I think, it comes back to this question I raised earlier, that if we get a fair deal up front, it means that even in political transitions, that deal is going to survive. But if we have a deal in which you make a representation to the government and then swindle the government into signing something else, then you open yourself up if there's change in government. There's always going to be, especially if it is the opposition that wins. They're going to question everything that the incumbent government did before. So if we have a good deal up front, then there's a possibility that in spite of the political transition, it survives whatever scrutiny it faces.
Do you think that clause ended up in the contract because the partner was lazy and they're throwing it out there, or do you think they were trying to pull one over on you?
Considering that one of the selling points of the project was telling us again and again that we didn't require a sovereign guarantee, then it seems like they were actually trying to deceive us. But one other thing I would add in terms of the risk that we're talking about was that projects in which there was, say, the World Bank, the African Development Bank, whether they were participating as an equity or debt partner, meant that even if the government changed, there was staying power to the project because there was a third party that had credibility. And I think one of the ways that we get around these governance issues is if we can find a third credible party who can be attached to the project, even if it's in a minority role, that helps to make it survive those changes.
In terms of maybe governments specifically, are there any other things that you think governments should do in order to ensure that their projects are both, one, beneficial for the government and the people it represents, and also that they're not being taken advantage of by maybe less scrupulous investors?
So the way I came into government was, and this started to get very popular across the continent, is these implementation units. So implementation units were basically these tiny islands of competence, sometimes within a sea of incompetence. So you have a small unit at the Ministry of Agriculture, there will be an implementation unit, and I was with something called the President's Delivery Unit. And one of the ways that we were able to execute projects were by having these small specialized units that could actually negotiate on you paid slightly more than the average civil servant, but is a pretty competent unit that managed to do that. And we're seeing that it started off first in Rwanda. They started to use that a lot more in Rwanda, and then it's been copied all over the continent. So I think that's one way of being able to do that, that you have a unit that the government respects, a unit from the government, and then we can trust them going forward. I would say the final thing I would say on this is what Mr. Njai said, not Njai, my bad. Yes, said, is that in frontier and emerging markets, there will be risks that you will not find in developed markets. And along with those risks will come the opportunity for rewards. What we can do as a government is to try to infuse some predictability in there by reducing the risk. But those risks are always going to be that is the nature of doing business in a frontier or an emerging economy.
I think, in terms of risks in frontier and emerging economies, Mr. Njai, this came up in the talk just before this one, where Mr. John Vanden Heuvel mentioned currency devaluation being a problem in Malawi. In your experience working across multiple economies on the continent, how have you dealt with the risk of currency devaluations and inflation and other monetary market volatility?
Well, in West Africa, where really I do most of my business, English-speaking West Africa, that's where you find currency devaluation. In Francophone West Africa, what they have is that the currency is tied to the euro, so the CFA. So you don't have much currency devaluation risk. So in Nigeria in particular, we make sure that we sell in Naira and we use as much local materials as possible and using local labor. And because It's a huge economy that is doable. But now, what we have done recently is we try to use the list of imported materials. So we're doing houses where it's semi-finished. We call them carcasses. I know carcasses means something else in the US, but in Nigeria, it means that you don't put in any finishing materials, no tiles, no sanitary. So all you give them is just a structure, and then this fence, and then you give them title. So they go ahead, and most of the building materials that are imported, it's now put in by them, because that's where really currency affects you. But in, for example, places like Gambia or Sierra Leone, where our target is mainly diasporans, people who live in the diaspora and who earn hard currency, our houses are priced in hard currency. So there's no risk there. We also avoid taking financing that is in hard currency. Because if we're taking any financing that's long-term from the DFIs, then that will affect you too. So we try to minimize as much as possible financing. And this is what I tell young entrepreneurs, because at my age now and my experience, I advise young startups and entrepreneurs that don't go to the bank to start a business or at the very beginning. Because I have the saying that, banks only give you an umbrella when the sun is shining, never when it's raining. So we avoid financing, and in this case, mostly hard currency financing, we avoid it. We take local, and it's also short term.
Great. And Mr. Cross, you're coming at developing new cities, new infrastructure projects from maybe a novel angle with your Silicon Valley background. In terms of your approach to financial de-risking, how do you approach that for long-term projects with longer time horizons than maybe Silicon Valley typically deals with?
I think one of the things that's uniquely special about Silicon Valley and why we've been able to create so much market value is that we're very good at having a big vision for something that's, decades out, but then breaking it down into manageable chunks and executing very rapidly, incrementally, and building the momentum that attracts more capital, more talent, et cetera, right? Because at the beginning, you just have some dream. You're not going to get the best investors in the world. You're not going to be able to attract the best executives in the world. You're not going to be able to compensate them. And so there's a million reasons why, you may have this huge dream 20, 30 years out, but you can't get the resources around it right at the beginning in order to execute against it. You need to craft an incremental strategy. This is something I think John at Small Farm Cities has just done an immaculate job of. There's so many projects that we've been hearing about 2, 3, 4 years that haven't really broken ground. These guys started with a tiny, what was the first site, an acre or something? Like an acre site, right? But it was a pilot, it was a proof of concept, it was real, right? And now they're expanding and expanding, in 2 years hence. We all saw all the stuff John threw up there. So much activity going on now. That all started from a tiny 1 acre site, right? So there's, going fast and starting small actually builds a lot of trust with people, is what I've found. Because, like we've talked about, there's been so many of these bad deals where the other partner was trying to put one over on the government, or they're doing something on spec and then they're just sitting there on some land concession hoping to do some deal later on. And if you're just showing right away, okay, we're talking about a project that might be $3, $4, $5 billion over the next 20 years, but we're going to put $1 million to work off the balance sheet immediately and show real progress on the ground immediately. That's kind of a breath of fresh air from what a lot of people are used to, right? And this also comes into infrastructure. Like I was speaking earlier about ports and airports and things like this. Everybody wants to do the Dubai model, right, and be a transshipment hub. And you're like, why? Like, why should somebody come in and put $3 billion into this massive transshipment terminal here? And then they're like, well, it's just like, it makes sense geographically. It's like, it makes sense in a lot of places geographically. That's not a good answer, right? So if you have a place where you need to start getting the ability to really send containers in and out, and you don't really have the the economic viability for a huge port, well, you need an incremental plan, right? Maybe it would make sense as a transshipment hub, 15, 20 years later. But you need a plan to start with, like, a pier, right? So at least you can bring the containers in directly instead of parking them offshore and then bringing them in and off with these tiny boats. That's horrendously inefficient. So let's first at least be able to pull the boats all the way up and just take the containers off. That's a big first step, which oftentimes can be done in the millions, right? So I think just being practical and taking that big vision and breaking it down into smaller chunks so that you can show that traction incrementally is really the magic. It's been the magic for these guys at Small Farm Cities, for Rendeavor as well. Rendeavor is now getting more into the political autonomy and SEZ type of side with Kenya, but it didn't start that way, right? They started executing, they showed a lot of progress, and then over time, people have wanted to hear their voice more, right? Because they're actually delivering stuff. So I think that's how you go, is like, yeah, think big, have a big vision, but break it down and move incrementally and quickly and show that you mean business and you're really gonna build. And people start respecting you. People respect teams of action, right? They don't respect talkers.
Mr. Moore, what kinds of risks do you think emerge when a major infrastructure project doesn't align maybe with the immediate expectations of communities where they're being built?
I think Brad talked about this in his very first comment about, making promises that are not kept, and projects that don't show progress over a long time. But I think more importantly, it goes back to Mr. Njai's points that when it comes to land issues in Africa, they're all, in a lot of places, I can't speak, in sub-Saharan Africa, there will be competing claims. The government in Monrovia, the government in Bangui, the government in Banjul will give you a concession. The parliament will pass it, and then you show up on the ground, and the government hasn't consulted with the people, and the people have claims to the land, and it becomes an issue. I'll give you, as Sam Darby out of Indonesia comes to Liberia and negotiates for 263,000 hectares, spends a decade in Liberia and only got 10,000 hectares. And millions of dollars later, sold the project to a local and just walked away after a decade, simply because it didn't align in terms of what the government in Monrovia did with the people on the land. And so I think this thing of just stopping in the capital, getting a piece of paper from the capital in a place where they're competing and overlapping claims to land, that becomes a big issue, and it stalls project and makes it difficult for them to move forward.
Great. Mr. Njai, do you have any final thoughts for us?
Well, my final word is that Africa is made up of 54 countries. Africa is not a country. It's a continent with 54 countries, and every country is different. Now, break it down even into Nigeria. Nigeria is 36 states, and every state is governed by a governor. So there's no single answer to doing business in Africa. But I like to always use a quote from the late Nelson Mandela. He says that it always seems impossible until it's done. So if you're doing business in Africa, you must have that very big appetite for risk. And for me, that's where I belong. Thanks.
I think that's a great thought to leave this panel on. Thank you all for showing up, and I'm going to hand it off to my colleague, Mwanda.